Hello everyone and welcome to this morning's Hoarding webinar. This will be the last one before our festive break, so welcome. I think everyone would agree, it goes without saying, that hoarding is a very complex issue and it makes up a significant proportion of the day-to-day caseload of housing practitioners. Furthermore, there are no quick fixes, you can't put a time limit on it, and the risks in terms of safeguarding and compliance are huge. Hoarding tendencies do not discriminate when it comes to socio-economic groups and can affect residents from all tenure types. However, the community-focused role of a social landlord means that we're well placed to make a difference, help people to move forward with their lives, sustain tenancies, and build trust. The process can only succeed if the tenant in question has ownership of the action plan and it's delivered at an agreed pace for their individual circumstances. Regular and appropriate communication must also be maintained along the way. Whilst the mental and emotional well-being of the tenant is paramount, we must also be acutely aware of the impact that hoarding can have on neighbouring residents, as well as the physical condition of the property itself. All of these responsibilities fall under the remit of a registered housing provider, in particular building and fire safety and compliance with environmental health legislation. These issues cannot be addressed in isolation, therefore the need for effective partnership working is essential. It is important for us as housing practitioners to map out the availability of support options within each locality and continue to come up with innovative solutions wherever possible. Thankfully, in recent years, we have seen more of a focus upon early intervention and non-legal remedies to enable vulnerable people to live independently in our neighbourhoods. There has also been a greater emphasis on aftercare for people with hoarding tendencies. If support is ended too soon, without addressing the longer-term issues, we are likely to see a reaccumulation of items at a property, a deterioration in a person's health and well-being, and also a lack of future engagement with the landlord. So to discuss all of the above challenges and more, I'm delighted to welcome Don Furby MBE, who's Deputy CEO of Calderdale Smart Move in Halifax, and also a former station manager with West Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service. Don will share with us his wealth of knowledge and experience of supporting vulnerable people and fire safety to highlight the implication of this from a housing management perspective. In part 2 of the webinar, we'll be joined by Shirley Falliger, who's a partner and the head of ASB at Forbes Solicitors. She will talk us through the importance of getting the legal process right when all other options have been explored and exhausted. This will also include an awareness of mental capacity and equality issues. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Dom. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'd say 154 participants at the moment. I don't know if that will grow, but it's always really strange talking to a screen. But I will try my best to engage and make sure that obviously I keep you or answer any questions that you may have. I know Darren's going to coordinate any questions and ask me direct if there's any sort of from any of the delegates that are joining us today. Merry Christmas, a cold morning. Darren rightly says I did 25 years in West Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service, and I retired 5 years ago as Assistant District Commander for Calderdale District, but I worked in 5 of the 4 districts across West Yorkshire. So within the 25 years, obviously, I dealt with lots of people who were vulnerable, who possibly come under the hoarding bracket, or needed support under the prevention side of the Fire and Rescue Service. For the last 5 years, I've worked for Calderdale Smart Move. It's an honour to work for a charity. I retired in 2018, and as I said, I've been now working for Calderdale Smart Move for the last 5 years, or roughly 5 years. I volunteered and supported prior to me retiring from the fire service. And working for the third sector is completely different to any other environment I've ever worked in before. Working in the public sector, obviously you're very structured, you're very led by policies, procedures, and requirements to fulfill the role within the brigade at the time. But working for a charity, you do have quite a lot more flexibility. On both sectors, third and public, we come across hoarding in various guises. So I'll just first slide, and hopefully you can all see the slides and everything. And if you do want to know more about our charity, and the charity the website's there as well. Let's see if it works. So, what is hoarding? Hoarding can be described as a collecting of and an inability to discard of large quantities of goods, objects, or information. Now, the last one, information, it's something that's quite new at the moment. Information hoarding can be in various guises, from us all holding information on emails and things on computers, and even holding computers because you're scared to get rid of them, and that could be laptops, phones, tablets, or anything like this. Hoarding can be in various ways, can be somebody collecting lots of different items for sentimental reasons, or it could be, like I said, because you just don't feel you can get rid of it. Hoarding is a mental health condition, and one of the slides says, is it? And that's a question to you all. Is hoarding a mental health condition? It is recognised in 2013 as hoarding disorder. And I don't want to start reading all the PowerPoints, but it's important for you to understand. And I don't want the people, who understand, a lot of the problems already regarding hoarding and understand the mental state of hoarding. But it's nice just to refresh what hoarding is and how many people it actually, people can be involved in hoarding, or how many people it touches. Due to the secretive nature of hoarding, it is difficult to know precisely how many are affected. So this says, and there is some rationale behind it, that roughly between 2 and 5% of the population can be touched by hoarding. Hopefully you can see all the PowerPoints, which equates to 1.2 million households across the UK. Now, that's amazing, isn't it? 1.2 million households across the UK, okay, can be touched or involved in hoarding. So you can say 22,000 people in Birmingham are affected by hoarding behaviour. Now, hoarding behaviour, obviously, as I've stated, can be in various guises. So is hoarding a mental health problem? Discuss. So what's your views? And I know it's really hard for you to talk to me face to face as we're doing this webinar, but is hoarding a mental health problem? My view is we've all been touched by hoarding or a mental health problem. Every single person who's watching this webinar has been touched in some shape or form by a mental health problem. You're probably lying if you say that you haven't, because we've all had a wobble. We've all walked down a tightrope and had a wobble. I had one in the West Yorkshire Fire Service when I was going to retire, but we've all had a wobble at some stage in our life. This morning, I was at my son's nativity at school, and because they knew I was in the fire service, and because they knew I work for a charity now that support the homeless and vulnerable across our district, 3 people came up to me to ask if we could support some of their family members. Now, one of those family members may have a hoarding issue. It's funny as well, when we were talking about how many people we all know who had a hoarding problem, I've talked to the trustees at Caldwell Smart Move, because I told them I was going to do this. I told them that obviously I wanted to support Darren and Forbes and what hoarding was about, because I'm really passionate about it from my public sector hat on to my third sector hat. And I'll just ask the trustees, do they know of a hoarder? And it was funny that, well, it's not funny, obviously, but it's funny that every single one of the trustees said they knew somebody that was hoarding, maybe a family member, a friend, a neighbour, a colleague. One of the trustees said that he used to rent properties out with an individual, and he used to pay his rent. He never, didn't pay his rent. He never had any issues about going into the property, never had any issues about, going to see if there's anything needed in the property, because the property was well maintained, it was looked after. So the landlord, the trustee, just left him to it. 10 years he was in that property, to the point where he needed to go into care. So when he went to care, he handed the keys back to the landlord, which was only a couple of weeks ago. And he passed on that he'd emptied the building and it was ready, for other people to move in. So he moved back in, he went in, the landlord, and he basically said he was shocked when he walked into the property. And he said, Dom, I couldn't believe when I went in. I've never known, never been in the property, never, needed to go in the property, because everything was always, looked after and bills were paid. But when I went in, there was 20 keyboards, 20 full keyboards, which were, organ keyboards, pianos, and they were dotted around the property. And he said he didn't know why this man, had just left him there. The reason being that he couldn't put him into his new property. But the reason why he kept him is because his dad was an organist at a church. And it was a very sentimental thing that he would look after. And, it brought back good memories about his family and his father. So he kept and stored keyboards. And it was they were dotted all around the property, but there was no risk to anybody. He just liked to hoard keyboards. And whenever he saw something that reminded him of his father, he kept it. Now, another trustee talked about his late auntie who lived down south, and she would collect everything from jumble sales. Absolutely everything. Her house was full of clutter. But it was a detached house and nobody ever went apart from family members. And they used to just talk about it was quite funny and things like this. And the ironic thing is she used to collect loads of things. And one year she sent a Christmas present to Peter's dad, a Christmas present. And it was an old pair of underwear. But to her, that old pair of underwear, and it sounds a little bit funny, was something that she bought and she thought would be nice and would be an appropriate present for this this brother. So hoarding can come in lots of different ways. So hoarding is, and it is classed as a mental health problem, and it is classed as something that people don't often want to talk about. So it's just something for you all to discuss and think about. And I don't know if Darren's got any questions, but I think people don't naturally think that hoarding, because we don't often talk about it, and there's different forms of hoarding. But hoarding is, in the true aspect of mental health, is a problem. So the levels of hoarding, and I think it's often nice to recap that everybody's perception of hoarding is very, very different. From level 1, which is on the left, that's probably like my daughter's bedroom, but to level 5, everybody's perception of hoarding is completely different. It's really, really hard for people's perception of hoarding, because my perception as a likes minimalistic things is, number one, would be far worse for me, because I can't deal with lots of clutter and things like this. But somebody's perception may be that level 5 isn't that bad. So it's us understanding as a group, as partners, as public sector, private sector, and third sector, to understand that everybody's perception of hoarding is very, very different. So when you go into a property, and you may think that, let's say, level 3 is really bad, but to somebody else, to that person, it's not that bad, as long as it's safe. Now, I'm a great believer in prevention. I'm working in the fire and rescue service. Prevention was a really big part of what I did when I set up lots of different things in Calderdale and across the brigade. Prevention about people, being safe. Now, going into a property and make sure it's safe, and things that we do in Calderdale is called, and in West Yorkshire is called, it used to be called affordable warmth. It's now called safe and well visits. It's about partnership working. So not just the third sector, not just the private sector, social care, things like this, all working together. You don't want to get to that point where there's a serious case review when the partner agencies haven't been working together. Now, in the fire service, we were very lucky that we were able to go into properties and people would let us into properties. The third sector, that's even easier. People generally come to us, or we will be welcomed into properties, because we're not seen as a threat. We're not seen as somebody that will somebody will lose their benefits or lose a property or something else. We're there to help people. So just to bear in mind that a perception of, hoarding is very different on the scale from 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The problem is when it becomes a risk to life, or a risk to somebody else, or a risk to a neighbouring property, or to that person who doesn't see it as a problem. But you just don't want to go in, a bull in the china shop, basically making people, stop everything that they're doing and making them feel that it's a major problem. It's about discussion. Is there any questions, Darren, at the moment? I just don't want to obviously go talk. Is there anything that I've forgotten at the moment? Is there any people asking questions about mental health? Anybody wants to share anything? Anybody wants to sort of discuss You know,
I think some of the questions coming through, Dom, obviously recognise that hoarding has a mental condition. I think that's unanimous from the delegates. Also, the importance of accessing support. You know, what's out there? How do we engage with it? How do we build trust with that particular resident, that customer, so he or she feels comfortable engaging and can move forward? And also looking at I don't know what you want to share your experience of the differences between collecting and hoarding. I mean, as a general rule, you would say, from our perspective, collecting would be sort of well organised, easy access items without posing any risk, whereas hoarding would be, you know, vast amounts spread over a large area and disorganised and probably difficult to access the individual items. So that's kind of, I mean, that's very basic, but I don't know if you want to expand on that from, I suppose, from a fire service perspective when you used to go into houses.
Yeah. So, I mean, just for everybody to see, I've just done a little bit of research prior to this webinar. Currently, researchers believe compulsive hoarding affects 1 in every 50 people, but it may impact on as many as 1 in every 20. That's a phenomenal amount of people that, you know, are affected by hoarding. Like Darren rightly says, collectors, you know, researchers, non-wasters, recycling, food hoarders, animal hoarders, over-sentimental hoarders, and typical hoarders. It's an amazing number of people and types of hoarding. From my fire service days, when I was based in Bradford, going into a property that there was a risk because they thought that it was a terrace house. There was an internal room attached to another property, and it was the actual room or the wall. And you'll see, some of the people that are on here will have seen this, that the room or the wall was bowing, you know, inwards. So there was a risk of collapse, and we only got called because of that neighbouring property. So we went into the property, and this person next door owned their own property, totally, you know, paid the bills, no problems, kept themselves to themselves. And that's the big thing. A lot of hoarders do keep themselves to themselves. They don't engage with lots of people sometimes until they do need that support. And we walked in, and it was full of newspapers. But when I say full of newspapers, and some of the people here will have seen this, you had to walk into the property sideways. So sideways, in, left, right, centre. The individual in the property was oblivious, completely oblivious to you know, the risk in the property. It was just the norm. And we all go into our properties. We all see stuff that we forget to pick up because you walk past them on it in your offices at work. But he was totally oblivious to the risk that was in that property. He'd collected for over 20 years newspapers, daily newspapers, you know, local newspapers and national newspapers. It was completely, you know, not a thought that it was a risk to anybody until the property next door saw that the wall was absolutely bowing. So we went in there and slowly working with partners. It's really hard because obviously social care weren't in there. Obviously emergency services were now, no other charities, because that person didn't need any support. So it's about communication, about slowly speaking to that individual about the risk, but not saying it's a problem because they don't see it as a problem. They don't see that hoarding until, you know, it has become a problem to other people is a problem. And it was slowly explaining that we needed to move some of those things out of the property, could we put them in a different location? He had a garage, it was full as well. And did they need to keep those newspapers for that long? And it was really, you know, slowly working with the fire service, explaining the risk. And when he understood the risk and understood the hazards to other people, he totally came on board. But it wasn't as going in, you will have to move this, you will need to get rid of this straight away. It was actually talking to the individual and over a matter of weeks explaining that this was more of a problem for other people as well, not just himself, because he didn't smoke. He cooked well, his kitchen was clean. He kept newspapers, and it was just something that he liked to do. So, and I think it's the thing that we all need to share, that it is about slowly approach, not jumping in, not making, you know, people feel that it's a massive problem. Apart from if it becomes a health problem like the food hoarders, if it's animals. You're going to laugh at, well, you will laugh at this. We went to a property who collect animals, but he had 10 monkeys in his property. The only reason we found out is because it was very, very clean. but it had caged areas, and a monkey got out of the property, and it was one of the small monkeys, and it was just not appropriate. It was not safe. It was not right. These monkeys were in a flat, and nobody had mentioned it. Nobody said anything. It was just this gentleman kept monkeys. But the risk was that these monkeys were a problem within, health and safety. It wasn't right. And it was down to communication, that the risk, not just to him, but to the monkeys, it wasn't fair. It was cruel. It was not right that they were kept in a flat and things like this. So that, again, was by slowly talking to this individual and make him feel that, it was a better thing to do to not, have these animals in a confined space. So I just want to share just a few things. Data hoarding that I mentioned earlier on. Data hoarding presents itself with a storage of data. This involves collections of emails, computers, electronic hard drives, and computer storage devices. This is in addition to hoarding. So research and understanding are still limited. Now, I'm talking to one of our employees the other day about hoarding emails, and we're always told to clear out emails. But that's another form of hoarding. There's good ways that we all collect 5,000, 10,000 emails, or we don't destroy or get rid of laptops or phones. And we can go into properties now that you have got people that store IT equipment. Now, the thing is, it's very, very new. It's very, very unresearched, but it's something that's growing, that people seem to understand that computer storage is something that people don't think is a problem, but it is becoming a problem because we're all so scared of getting rid of a laptop or a computer or something that's outdated. So you will start to see more and more of this going across, the country, that people are going to store IT equipment. So it's just a little bit of information for you to understand there. What kind of things can I hoard? Everyone will have a different experience of hoarding. It's possible to hoard anything physical or digital. These are some examples of things that people commonly hoard. Now, I'll just let you quickly to read through these. And I think you could probably add to the list. Bills. Every 3 months, I will go through and I will shred bills, just because that's the type of person I am. But some people will be scared to get rid of them. Food. Now, food can be a problem because my mum has an old jar of piccalilli, which is from 1988 at the back of the cupboard, but she won't throw it away because that's what they did years and years ago. You'll all be laughing, or some of you will be laughing, because you'll remember mums, dads, grandmas, granddads who will keep food because they just don't throw it away because it's just something that they didn't do because they think they can use it. We've all got stories of properties that we've been into where people have stored food. I went into a property and we went into the cellar and it was just full of food, the microwavable food, because this person thought there was going to be a nuclear war, and he, for some reason, had microwavable food in freezers and hundreds of tins and bottles and different containers. And it was the only reason why we found it is because we went to a fire to the property, but we searched the property and inside there was just masses and masses of food. And again, we referred that person to social care and the charity and the mental health. We worked with Leeds Mind and we worked with other mental health charities to work with that individual to break that, I suppose, to break that stigma that, that they don't need to store that amount of food. Amazing thing now working for charities, understanding what charities do. Charities are an amazing group of people, and I know public sector, housing associations, probably all work with charities. The good thing about what we do, we work obviously with the vulnerable, homeless, street homeless, but the vulnerably housed. People have to get sometimes to probably the let me think of the word here. The last point before they ask for help, they've got the benefits of being stopped. The domestic violence, they've lost a job, they're about to lose their properties, the street homeless, they've come out of the forces, they've come out of prison, they may have had some structure, the partner's died, the partner's left them. And then quite often a lot of people turn to charities for support because they know that charities will help them. For those sectors that I don't work with charities, even though I work obviously for a charity now, I would openly encourage you to work with local charities in your areas, because a lot of those charities are working already with people who have mental health issues, but probably some of the charities don't know what support is out there. Working from the public sector to now the third sector, I can link what support is out there. So link about the safe and well training, link about hazard spotting, link about neighbourhood policing teams, link with, the support with mental health providers, and making sure that it's a joint approach when you go into a property. Because sometimes if you go with a uniform on, or if you go as a housing association, straight away sometimes the door's closed. But sometimes if you ask the charity to go and support that individual, that barrier can be knocked down quite quickly. Charities are an amazing organisation. Years ago, it would probably be an add-on, probably be an extra, support. Quite a lot of charities now, because we're a commissioned charity in Caldale, you are a necessity. You are needed. You are a charity that's, needed on the front line for lots of services, from, St John's Ambulance, from the British Red Cross, from when you go to a fire, a charity will turn up to help rehouse people. So just remember that you might not know about charities in your area. You probably do, and I don't want you to teach you to suck eggs. You probably know about all the charities in your areas, but there are other charities that are out there that you might need to just do a little bit of a search on and see is there any support. But make sure you talk together. We do seminars with all our partner agencies, and we're fully incorporated into the partnerships. So we'll work with Caldale Council, we'll work with the police, we work with the fire, we work with, the NHS, we work with mental health, social care. We have social services that refer into us. And that's really important, because if we're just giving a food parcel out, we sometimes will get into the property just to offer advice and support as well. And also some of the clients that we work with will then come back to us once they're being supported, will come and start volunteering, which helps their mental well-being. Just some pictures. I think it's really interesting to understand, you'll have seen them. Again, the top right, I took that picture from my daughter's bedroom. I didn't. She'll kill me for saying that. But fridges that we talked about, collectors, and people collect all sorts of things from, games to Lego but they don't see it as a problem. But it's when it becomes a problem, when it's a risk of evacuation. We go into properties, then we'll ask the fire service to come in and just talk about an evacuation plan. So we might not say to them, you need to remove some of the items, but we'll explain to them that there's a safety problem here. There's a little bit that you need to talk to maybe the fire service. Will come in and not tell you to get rid of it, but explain about you need a smoke detector, or you might need an evacuation and things like this. So things just that you need to consider. I am conscious of time, Darren, so but other types of hoarders that you'll have all seen: animals, obviously normal, case studies, opportunities for participants to discuss, good news, bad news stories, open forum. Is there any stories that people want to share? Is there any questions there, Darren, before I move on?
Yeah, it's really, Dom, I think one of the key questions that's coming out of the discussion, and again, one that we can all relate to, is balancing the support for the individual or the family regarding, slowly at the pace that's right for them, and building the trust and doing things gradually, against the real risk of the potential fatality, a fire, the physical condition of the building, complaints from other residents who were affected by it, and the wider community as well. So there's a lot of pressure on housing providers in terms of regulation and compliance as well. So for frontline staff, they've kind of got those dual pressures of making sure, showing that empathy and compassion and working as best they can with the individual, but also making sure that risk is eliminated or reduced as best as possible as well. And I think that coincides with situations where, as you said, a lot of people with hoarding tendencies, they pay the rent, the properties, there's no evident issues. Obviously they'll be picked up with home visits and neighbourhood inspections and such. But if it hasn't met that social care threshold, then how do we work more collaboratively with the third sector charities such as yourselves, and what is the extended role for housing providers given capacity and resources as well? I think that's certainly a challenge.
Yeah, and I think it's important, Darren, that we have, obviously you're aware, Darren, we have a referral scheme. So we have partner agencies that refer into us, and within that referral scheme, we could do something called an outcome star, which some of our delegates will be aware of. There we talk about their needs, benefits. Do they need support? Do they need social care support? Is there some support that they need? And that outcome star is an amazing thing that feeds back to the providers and the benefits, but also to the people, but also feeds back to our client workers that work with that client. So it is important that you refer in and out, and you pass on information, share information on. So public sector, third sector hoarding support, it is really important that all sectors, as you rightly said, Darren, support each other and communicate, and make sure that the communication between all levels, is open and transparent, and creating partnerships, or what we used to create a friendship. So it's really important that the communication lines is open, transparent, and people feel that they can, and people don't feel pressured. When the client, or we call them clients, don't feel that they're doing anything wrong. They need to be understood that, the problems that you've just said could be a risk to other people, a risk to themselves, a risk, to their family members and other people. So just quickly, is that, and just let you read that for just a minute. It is a disorder.
Just something that was flagged up there, Dom, as well. The cost of additional support. I know with commissioned services, there's not necessarily a charge because that's factored into the wider local authority offer, for want of a better term. But I know some organisations may say, they're charging so much an hour for, smaller charities with specialist hoarding support. And is that viable for that particular organisation? If it's a small housing provider, is the budget in place with that as well? So that's something to think about. Also, in terms of establishing the root causes, as you've said, the more we can build trust with individuals to find out what really triggered that hoarding tendency, and put measures in place that are appropriate for them to move forward, really. And I think, again, it's that familiarity as well, where possible, working with the same person and building up that rapport, rather than having different people and disorganisation, that break from routine, going around the homes as well. I think that's important.
You don't want to get to the point where it's a serious case review and then you start finger pointing. You need to get to prevent before. You need to get to discussing before. Don't be scared to talk, open and transparent. Make sure there's a good referral. We have a referral system in place into Caldwell Smart Move from public sector organisations. So the police will refer into us, the fire will refer into us, housing associations will refer into us to support vulnerable people. The good thing is, as charities, Darren, barriers are generally lowered quite a lot because people see us not as a governing body. So thank you to everybody. I hope that, please look at, obviously, Caldwell Smart Move. More than happy if you want to ask us any questions about how we refer people and how people referring to us. More than happy to share that information. But thank you very much. It's been really interesting and a strange way to do things. But thank you to all the people across the country, and hopefully you'll have a really good Christmas.
Thanks, Dom. That was really useful. And again, just a reminder that the recording of this webinar will be shared along with the slides, so everyone will have access to those as well. I think it's also a good opportunity. I've noticed from the chat that people in different areas are working with different agencies who offer hoarding support. If we can share them amongst ourselves, we'll certainly share details of the agencies we currently work with in different parts of the country, and say it's just a good opportunity to share knowledge. I think at this point, or just to mention as well, when Dom touched on the issue with newspapers, I know we've worked with housing providers where there's been an accumulation of newspapers, and we've worked with the individual to photograph the front page because the dates were important to him in this particular circumstance. So he had a collection of his newspapers. I mean, it does depend on if people have, IT access as well. So he was able to have a file with all the front pages of the newspapers on that he could look at, and again, it wasn't accumulating the hoard. So that was just a quick example, just following on from what Dom recommended. So we're on to the legal section now, so I'll hand you over to my colleague Shirley Farragher. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Hi. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Shirley Farragher. I am a partner in the Housing Litigation Department at Forbes. And one of the main areas I deal with is usually antisocial behaviour. But also as part of my role, I do regularly deal with hoarding on behalf of some of our clients. And some of the cases I'm dealing with are actually quite complex at the moment, and they are taking quite a long time to go through the court system. So what I'm going to do this morning is I'm just going to try and give you a few little tips, as well as telling you a bit about the legal process and how it would work. So if we could move to the first slide, please, Catherine. So on this slide, you'll see that I've just reiterated what some of the risks are and also some of the implications for housing associations when there is hoarding. The obvious one is fire, because what tends to happen is there are so many combustible items in the property that if there's a fire, the property will usually go up very, very quickly, which of course means there's limited time for the fire service to get in and rescue the occupants. There's risk to the fire officers when they go in as well. And there's also the risk to the neighbouring properties. And so it is very, very serious for social landlords. And it's something that has to be taken urgently and dealt with quickly. Health and safety is also an issue as well, because the fact a property is hoarded can often prevent you from getting in to do your gas safety checks, your electrical safety checks, which stops you meeting your compliance requirements as expected by the regulator. So that's a massive issue as well. Damage to property ties into that a little bit, in so much as in many cases you'll have the hoarded items leaning on things like electrical cables, which means that the cables can get damaged, and that then again increases the fire risk and also increases the need to get in to repair the damaged wires. And if you can't get in, or the person won't allow access, how do you do that? Damage to property can be quite significant. I've dealt with a number of cases where we've got things like there are no sanitary appliances working in the properties, so the toilet's not working, usually it'll be blocked. There'll be no hot water or heating typically, because the person generally isn't keeping on top of their gas meter and their electricity meter, so they don't have any heating or hot water in the winter. Not only is that a risk for them, it also does place the landlord at some risk, because if somebody's vulnerable, then obviously you have got a duty of care to make sure that they're looked after, and especially in the type of weather that we're having today, where there's snow and ice on the ground. Noxious smells can be an issue as well. Often, as Dom said, people will hoard things like food, and even if it's kept in the fridge or it's kept in Tupperware, when it's been kept for a long period of time, you then do get to the point where you've got foul smells coming from the property. Vermin. I'm dealing with a case at the moment where a gentleman is hoarding wild pigeons and wild rats at his property, numerous of them. So that's become a real issue. And also, if somebody's hoarding pet animals such as dogs and cats or monkeys, as Dom was referring to, there's obviously the welfare concern for those animals as well. So then the implications of this for you as the social landlord is you'll usually be getting complaints from neighbours. You'll usually be worried about the health and safety of residents. In severe cases, you may end up with the tenant dying due to a fire, due to being freezing cold and left in the property, due to not being able to look after themselves. And if that happens and the person's then discovered, usually there'll have to be some sort of inquest or case review to look into what's happened and why. And then at that point, you're into the realms of receiving adverse publicity, which nobody wants. So you really are better off not being in that position at all. And if we can move to the next slide, please, Catherine. Thank you. So in terms of pre-legal steps then, because as Dom has said, and Darren as well, it's a very long process trying to deal with hoarding. Often the statutory powers which are available to the local authority, which would let them go in and sort of clear if they had to and things like that, they're not going to be a long-term solution usually, because often what will happen is you'll clear the property and it can actually exacerbate the behaviour and make it worse. So you have to try and ensure that the underlying causes of the behaviour are being dealt with if you can. And psychological intervention such as cognitive behavioural therapy is commonly accepted as a really good way of trying to do this. So going back to the start, what do you do? Well, the first thing really is to make sure that you're visiting the person regularly and trying to keep a list of what the property looks like on each and every visit. If you can keep detailed notes, that's brilliant. If you can try to take dated photographs of each of the rooms, again, that's brilliant. Something not everybody does because they feel it's a difficult subject to broach with the tenant is to ask about any disabilities or vulnerabilities. You might find the tenant will open up to you and they'll just volunteer the information. And if they do, it might be worth getting them at that stage to sign a consent form, which enables you to make any referrals you need to say the general practitioner, social services, the mental health team, to try and see if you can get some more information and to try and see if they can make further referrals so that the person can be helped and assessed. I think as well, preparing a risk assessment. So there are tools available to help you to do that, which I'll look at in a few moments. That's very important. And it's also a good idea to keep reviewing the risk assessments as the case progresses over the months. Involve relevant charities. So people like Dom, who can go in and really help the person in a sort of caring way, is always a good idea if there are such agencies in your area. And also developing an action plan with the tenant and then writing to them to confirm the steps that you'd expect them to take. But also, and I think this is really crucial, and Darren's already touched on it, it's the importance of partnership working in these cases. So I would always advise a client to convene a professionals meeting urgently to discuss the case at the earliest opportunity, and then to carry on meeting at regular intervals throughout the case. So if I was dealing with this sort of case, I would usually help my clients to construct letters to social services, the mental health team, the GP. So even if we haven't got that consent, I would ask the local authority to consider its duties under Section 9 and sometimes Section 42 of the Care Act. And I'd be saying, we as the landlord, we think that this tenant has vulnerabilities. We think that they are in need of care and support. Please, could you assess them? And then if the local authorities suspect that the person is in fact in need of support, then they must carry out an assessment. But the difficulty arises in cases where you've got a tenant who won't engage with social services or won't engage with anybody. And I've got a few cases at the moment that have that scenario going on. One of the cases is a gentleman with schizophrenia who point blank refuses to take his medication, which means he's very distrustful of other agencies. So in that case, what we've done is, because social services have tried to assess him and he's refused assessment, but under Section 11 of the Care Act, if the person is refusing assessment because they lack capacity to agree to the assessment, or they're at risk of abuse and neglect, then social services still have to, if it's in the person's best interests, continue to try to sort the assessment out. And it's interesting to know, and I probably should point out because it's useful for yourselves, that hoarding is considered to be self-neglect for the purposes of the Care Act. If we look at the statutory guidance on how to use the Care Act, which was updated in November of this year, it's quite clear that hoarding is considered to be self-neglect and therefore would fall under the remit of Section 11. And that means that the local authority should really try to assess under Section 42. The reason I refer to those sections is because, as I say, I think if you're writing to the agencies, you do need to know which sections it is that you want them to look at, because that can be helpful. If we can move on to the next slide, please, Catherine. So I think when you're sort of doing your first visit, and as we said a minute ago, it's useful to sort of risk assess the situation. So when you first go into the property, if you can try to develop a rapport with the tenant, if you can, try not to be there in a sort of judgmental and critical like demeanour. Try and get their trust, try and work with them. Try and encourage them to consider each of the rooms in the property in turn. And the clutter image rating can be quite useful. So on the slide, we've got the pictures from a bedroom, and you would basically ask the person, where on that scale they think they are, and where you think they perhaps need to be, or where you'd like them to try to get to. Because the visual aids can be a good way of helping the person to see how the situation is appearing. It might be the person asks for reasonable adjustments, and if they do, there's nothing wrong at all with agreeing to help them. So, for example, I have a number of cases at the moment where we've provided a skip, or even help with removing the items, because what that does, it kind of empowers the tenant to be involved in the process themselves. And that is in accordance with the Care Act, because there are 6 principles, and one of them is that really you should be trying to empower the tenant wherever you can. Once you've sort of agreed an action plan with the person, follow it up in writing, and just then continue to monitor the situation. And hopefully over a period of time, there might be an improvement. But of course, there might not be. And if we could move on to the next slide, please, Catherine. So I think if the problems are persisting, the first step would really be to send a pre-action letter. Now, it can be from yourselves, actually, because that would comply with the pre-action protocol, which governs litigation. But equally, it could be a solicitor's letter, and sometimes that holds a bit more clout, because often the tenant might be ignoring your letters, but if they get a letter from a legal firm or from your in-house legal team, they might take it a bit more seriously. So in that letter, you would confirm previous discussions, confirm your expectations and timescales going forward, and then it would have to obviously confirm what the consequences of non-compliance with the request could be. So you'd be saying ultimately it may be an injunction and or possession, depending on many factors which you would need to consider first. And if we could move on to the next slide, please, Catherine. So before any legal action is taken, I would recommend, and particularly in cases of hoarding, that you prepare an Equality Act review to try and determine what the next steps would be. So when you're doing this, you need to be saying to yourself, does the tenant have a disability? And if they do, does the hoarding arise from that disability? So, for example, if the person's got hoarding disorder, the chances are that the hoarding is almost certainly going to be arising from that disability. Similarly, people can suffer from obsessive compulsive disorder, and that can cause hoarding or exacerbate hoarding tendencies as well. Depression, the person generally might just not have the motivation to sort of clear the property. Extreme loneliness or bereavement can cause people to hang on to belongings. Diogenes syndrome, where the person sort of may have tendencies to hoard animals and things like that. So if you think that the hoarding's arising from the disability, then you need to make that clear in your Equality Act review. Then you need to ask yourself, what am I doing that's going to subject this person to unfavourable treatment? So seeking an injunction or going for possession, for example, would both subject the person to unfavourable treatment. So then you want to say, what are my legitimate aims in this case? And obviously your legitimate aims in a hoarding case will be preventing fire, preventing damage to your property, ensuring that you can get to your appliances in the property to perform electrical and gas safety inspections, protecting the life of the tenant and also your other residents and potentially even your staff, avoiding adverse criticism. So these are all the things that would be classed as legitimate aims, and the court would find them perfectly acceptable. Then you need to ask yourself, will the action I'm taking achieve my legitimate aims? So, for example, if you're thinking about going for an injunction, is it going to work? Possibly not if the person's got hoarding disorder. If they've got hoarding disorder and they genuinely can't help it, then having an injunction that says they have to clear the property is not going to solve the problem. You'd basically be setting them up to fail. So in that scenario, you'd only be left with possession. But then you've got to ask yourself, is the action that I'm looking to take no more than necessary to achieve my legitimate aims? So at that point, you're basically saying, have I exhausted all other options before I'm taking this legal action? And then finally, you consider your duties, your public sector equality duties under section 149 of the Equality Act. And you're sort of thinking, well, if the tenant's disabled and the action I'm taking is going to have an adverse effect on them, is there anything I can do to minimise the impact of that on them? So, for example, I'm serving a notice on them, but I might give them a longer time scale than I usually would before I issue the proceedings, to give them a further chance to try and rectify some of the breaches of tenancy. You might serve it on them in the presence of a support worker so that there's someone there to help you explain the situation to them and to try and help them to resolve things so that legal action isn't necessary. And then finally, you'll have your conclusion. If you were originally thinking about getting an injunction, but you get to the public sector equality duty and you've decided you're not going to get an injunction, in your conclusion, I would be saying, at first we thought we'd get an injunction, but actually we've considered our options and we now think possession is going to be a better option. So you're basically explaining an overall summary as to why you are deciding ultimately to take the action that you are. And if we could go to the next slide, please, Catherine. So then you're left, unfortunately, if you're a registered provider in particular, you're left in this difficult scenario because you've only got two legal options available to you at this point. You can either seek an injunction or you can apply for possession of the property. Although the local authority have other powers, as I've said earlier, often they're more of a sort of quick fix than a long-term solution. And if you're a registered provider, you don't have those powers anyway. So if we can move on, Catherine, we'll now look at each of these in turn. So first, we've got our breach of tenancy injunction. And basically what we're saying is a tenancy agreement is a contract. The tenant has breached the contract by letting the property get into an unacceptable condition. So therefore, the remedy for breach of contract is damages. But there is a little doctrine called equity, which basically says that if damages aren't going to put you into the position that you would have been in if there hadn't been a breach, then you can apply for specific performance of the tenancy, which in other words is an injunction. So if it's appropriate to do so, it's advisable to try an injunction before you go for possession, because then you can show that going for possession is very much a last resort. But the problem is, will the tenant be able to comply with an injunction? Will the injunction work? And if we can move on to the next slide, Catherine. So the Mental Capacity Act basically says that if at a material time a person can't make a decision in relation to a particular matter because of an impairment or a disturbance in the functioning of the mind or brain, then it doesn't matter whether that disturbance is permanent or temporary, they would lack capacity to do the specific act. So if a person doesn't have the mental capacity to comply with the clause of their tenancy around hoarding, you wouldn't be able to get an injunction to enforce that clause of the tenancy. And I have actually had a case where that situation has arisen. I had a lady in East Lancashire who the property was hoarded from floor to ceiling. She had a rabbit at one point which disappeared in the property under the various items and was never seen again. There were all sorts of issues where she'd deliberately smashed the windows. There was some antisocial behaviour as well. We took the case to court down the possession route. She was assessed. She was found to have mental capacity to instruct a solicitor and to litigate, but not to comply with the clause of her tenancy that required her to keep her property in a tidy, clean and satisfactory condition. So on that basis, we would never have been able to ask for an injunction in that case, and we could never have agreed an SPO which required her to clear the property or to keep it tidy, because she wouldn't have been able to comply with it. If we can move on to the next slide, Catherine. What I should say, though, is that there is a presumption of capacity. So you should always assume the person has capacity unless you've got evidence to the contrary. If you issue an application for an injunction and then you get evidence to say they lack capacity, the injunction would have to be discharged. And the difficulty then is potentially you could have to pay the defendant solicitor's legal costs. Now, obviously, we would always try and negotiate you out of that scenario, but it can't be guaranteed. And it would very much depend on the character of the defendant solicitor as to whether that's something they would be agreeable to. So you do have to be a little bit careful when thinking about injunctions. And if we can move to the next slide, please, Catherine. The other thing to be very careful of is, although there is a presumption that people have capacity, we still have to consider the Equality Act, because if they have capacity, but they also have another disability, and if that disability would stop them complying with the injunction, that means that the injunction wouldn't be able to work. You wouldn't be furthering a legitimate aim by seeking it, and therefore seeking the injunction would be discriminatory. And I don't know whether any of you are familiar with the case of Rosebery Housing versus Williams, which was, I think it was dealt with towards the end of last year, if I remember rightly. And in that case, they'd sought an injunction to deal with antisocial behaviour against a tenant who had obsessive compulsive disorder. And one of the clauses they were looking for was to stop her from filming her neighbours and taking photographs of her surroundings and filming her surroundings. But in the conduct of the litigation, it came out through two special psychiatric reports that the OCD made her film her surroundings because she felt safer when she did so. She wasn't necessarily filming the neighbours, and there was nothing sinister about what she was doing, although the neighbours thought there was. Because Rosebery had issued proceedings seeking the injunction based on this idea that they wanted to stop her doing this, the court said, well, how can she stop doing it when it's a symptom of her obsessive compulsive disorder? She can't. So actually what you're doing is discriminatory. And in that case, they were actually ordered to pay £27,500 in damages to Ms. Williams for injury and injury to feelings and distress. So I only use that example because even though it's an antisocial behaviour case, it still applies in a hoarding case in situations where the person has hoarding disorder, or they potentially have OCD or any other mental illness that's causing the hoarding or causing them from to not be able to address it, essentially. And although the Rosebery case isn't a Court of Appeal case, the fact that it was dealt with by His Honour Judge Luber, who's a very well-known former tenant barrister, it gives it a lot of clout, and it's been widely publicised. And the difficulty is now is that many defence solicitors may well seize the opportunity to raise counterclaims of that ilk going forward. So we just have to be careful. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Catherine. So if we can't go for our injunction because we don't think it's going to achieve our legitimate aims or the tenant lacks capacity, we're left as a social landlord in the situation where you may well have to apply for possession of the property. And if you do, you'd obviously be relying on ground 12, which is breach of tenancy, ground 13, which is damage to the property, and ground 14, which is the behaviours causing nuisance and annoyance to neighbours and to the landlord. Next slide, please, Catherine. Now, these are discretionary grounds for possession. So what you have to do is you have to serve the correct notice of seeking possession, where you refer to the grounds you're relying on and you particularise the allegations that you say show that those grounds are made out. But you then have to persuade the court that it's reasonable to make a possession order as well. And when the court considers reasonableness, there is case law that says they have to consider all of the facts of the case on the day that they are hearing the case. So if that's at a final trial, to use an antisocial behaviour case as an example, if you get to the trial and the antisocial behaviour is stopped, the court may well decide it's not reasonable to evict. If you've got a hoarding case and by the time of the trial the property's been cleared, the judge may well decide it's not reasonable to evict. So those are just some examples. And if we could move to the next slide, please, Catherine. So reasonableness then, the sorts of things the court's going to look at, well, they're going to consider whether all legal and non-legal alternatives have been exhausted first. So have warnings been given? Has support been offered? Have the disabilities been considered, if there are any, and relevant agencies been contacted? And is there no prospect of the situation improving? And you might realise that those are all things that if you followed my little action plan at the start and you followed the pre-litigation steps I suggested, by the time you get to this stage, you should be able to show that what you're doing is reasonable. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. So in summary, I think you need to work with the tenant as best you can and try and get a manageable action plan in agreement with them and monitor it regularly, very much baby steps. Seek a multi-agency approach at an early stage and make referrals in writing, because then you've got a paper trail which you can use in support of subsequent legal action if you have to. Fire risk assessment from the fire service. Also, the fire service might be able to give recommendations about how to minimise the risks to the person. Find out about capacity and disability early on in the situation. Complete your Equality Act review, and then just consider whether there's any other practical steps at all you can take. Think outside the box. If there aren't and you're going for possession, I would suggest you use a solicitor, only because there are a lot of Equality Act considerations when you're dealing with a hoarding case. So I think that covers the topic, the sort of subject matter I wanted to cover. Does anybody have any questions? Darren, I think you've been monitoring them.
Hi, sure. I know you probably covered it in part of your discussion as well. I mean, one of the delegates highlighted an issue, a Hoarding case where they're going for access injunctions, tenants not engaging with mental health, not engaging with social care, just basically talking out the window and not leaving the property. And also the police don't see it as a particular issue at the moment. So next steps, really.
Yeah, I mean, that case is tricky because there probably will be mental health problems and you're applying for an injunction. Now, if the tenant doesn't turn up at court, you should really still tell the court what your concerns are. But ultimately, if they don't turn up at court, you might get your injunction. The problem then is, what are your next steps? Because if the injunction isn't complied with, your only option is to apply to commit the tenant to prison. But the difficulty with that is that's not going to achieve what you want. That's just going to mean they're not even at the property to work with. So really, you're still left in that difficult position then where you're having to go down the applying for possession route. I think all you can sort of do is try to get the tenant to engage. So I think what I should say is, throughout any legal case, it doesn't mean just because you've issued proceedings that you don't then try. You as the landlord still have to keep trying to engage the person. I would write to the other agencies, particularly if you do think there's mental health or capacity issues, and ask them to assess the person and see if they can sort of step in and help. The difficulty is, if they don't, you do get left in a very difficult position where you might have to apply for possession. And the difficulty then is the tenant might not engage with that either, and they might end up just getting evicted. In my experience, 9 times out of 10, when it gets to that stage, you do get a solicitor, and then you end up in quite a lengthy legal process, because nearly always they don't have, well, quite often, not nearly always, but they won't have capacity to litigate. And the difficulty then is, if they're a lone person, which they often are, and there's no litigation friend, then the office of the official solicitor has to get involved. And you're into the realms of the case then taking 2, 3, 4 years to resolve. So it is very difficult. Hopefully your solicitor should be able to help you with that. But I hope that kind of helps a little bit. Just partnership working, really, like Darren said earlier. See if you can get any charities involved, see if there's any way of getting there.
Thanks, Shirley, that's great. Just a couple of other things. We're aware in some areas that there's support groups specifically for people with hoarding tendencies. I know in Yorkshire and also parts of the Northwest as well. So that might be something to look in your own individual areas, where hoarders can basically share their experiences in a safe place, in confidence, and look at how they can, put their own plans together to overcome these issues as well. I've also come across situations where people who have been through the hoarding process and kind of come through the other side have been able to share their experiences with people who are going through it currently. Again, we've got to be mindful that it's not about putting people on show, and it's their own personal lives. But if someone is comfortable to do this, then that can be a real advantage to share that knowledge from someone who's been directly affected as well. So I think that's really useful. Just to kind of finish off with as well, I've got just an extract from a coroner's report about a hoarding case. I know it was a few years ago, but I always think it's quite poignant, so I'm just going to read it out. It says, "These dreadful living conditions were known to the landlord of the property, and it appears that some efforts had been made to engage with the deceased and her son to try and deal with the problem. However, it is abundantly apparent that little or no progress had been made in this regard, and the property was a significant risk, not only to the occupants, but also to neighbours, members of the emergency services, such as firefighters, who were entering the property. I take note that hoarding is now becoming better publicised and indeed is now subject of television programmes. There seems to be a lack of appreciation of the enormous risk that such hoarding poses to occupants, neighbours and members of the emergency services. It is very likely that had there been earlier and more effective intervention, Mrs. X would not have died. So that's a direct quote from a coroner's report. So I think that's poignant to ourselves as housing practitioners to make sure that wherever possible, all interventions are covered and all avenues are explored to make sure that that person is safe in the home. So I just kind of thought I'd throw that one in there because it said when you see, you know, that in black and white from a coroner's report, it does make everyone think. So unless there's anything else, Shirley,
can I just make one other point that might be useful for people? I get asked a lot whether from a data protection perspective, you can share information with other agencies. And I was just going to say very quickly that if the purpose of the sharing of the information is to get the person assessed and to get them help with their health and their social care needs, you can share information with the local authority, with social services, with the mental health team and with the GP. And they can also share information with you. And that's because Section 6 of the Care Act anyway places a duty on local authorities and partner agencies, which includes registered providers, to share information in those sorts of scenarios. And also because there is an exclusion in GDPR, Article 9(2)H says that if the disclosure is necessary for the purpose of medical diagnosis or provision of health or social care, then you can disclose it to social services and the mental health team for that purpose. I've used that to be able to share medical reports in one of my cases with social services to ask them to then assess the person. So I just thought that might be useful, and that's everything.
Thanks, Shirley. That's really helpful. So I think that brings us to the end of today's session. So a big thank you to Shirley and Dom as our guest speakers, and thank you to you all for attending. I hope you found it useful. If you do have any further issues, further questions, if you can just drop us an email, and we'll make sure we get a response to you, whether it's from ourselves or from any of the partner agencies who may be better placed to help. So I hope you all have a very happy Christmas and take care of yourselves, and we'll see you in the new year. If you do have any ideas for any other future sessions, then by all means let us know and we'll make sure we get that addressed for you. So thanks everyone.